Delmarva Today with Don Rush.
It's been called the American dream, but for some it is less than that. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. We often see our country from the inside, accepting its history, unaware that our aspirations may not meet the reality of the nation. Tiffany Drayton has written an autobiography entitled Black American Refugee, Escaping the Narcissism of the American Dream. She recounts her story as a young girl coming to this country from Trinidad and Tobago with her mother, only to become disillusioned with the gap between the dream and the reality. And we have her on the phone this morning. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
So tell me then a little bit about what your expectations were like coming to this country, both obviously for yourself, you were very young, but also for your mother.
I think my mother, as like all immigrants, came to the United States of America with the hopes and dreams of finding that equality and freedom and financial freedom and economic opportunity. I think ultimately all Black people are always looking to realize Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream, which is having a space where your children aren't judged by their skin color, but instead are given opportunity regardless, right? And opportunity that's the same as what a white child would get. So my mother ultimately came to America seeking for her children of color what white children are often given.
Do you have any sense about what she knew about the struggle of Black people in America as an immigrant coming to this country?
I think immigrants or even people in other countries really get this painted picture of the United States of America that doesn't reflect reality, right? You have this Hollywood mechanism, for example, or even music culture that continuously sells this perfect dream, this picturesque scene. And so my mother would have not really understood what it meant to be a Black woman in America because she wasn't given that lens through which she could see reality for Black people. Instead, she was given this fictionalized kind of white-focused lens. And so she would have had really not much understanding of what she was walking into.
One of the things that struck me about the book is that, at least for a while, you seem to separate yourself from African Americans in the sense of taking on some of the white stereotypes of African Americans. You associated with some folks on the tennis court, as it were. Tell me a little bit about that experience and that absorption of that stereotype.
Yes, that really speaks to, my thesis, which is that America employs narcissistic abusive tactics on Black people. And part of abuse is that it teaches you to hate yourself. And so you internalize self-hate. So I really wanted to be as honest about that experience for me as a child, where I was being exposed to all of these negative images and imagery and also messages about Black people in America and what it meant to be Black in America, whether it is you're calling them thugs or whether you're calling them welfare queens. These are messages that I received as a young child and internalized. So, of course, there's this desire to distance yourself from what you view as a bad thing. And then with time you realize it's not just that the people are bad, but it's that the people who are controlling the narrative are.
And eventually you find yourself on the opposite side, as it were, in school with the soccer team and so on. And suddenly, Tell me a little bit about, and tell me what it felt like to have that realization.
Yeah, well, I moved between many different neighborhoods, and the book kind of captures that. So what you're speaking about, in this instance, I was living in this very well-to-do Floridian neighborhood where I had access to, like, a tennis team that was really well-funded, and we had great equipment, and the team was, of course, mostly white. And so here I am, this Black kid on this team, experiencing all of this privilege. But then when my family was forced to move because we were priced out of that neighborhood, I ended up in a more minority school, and immediately I saw how differently the access point to the basic privileges that I had in Florida, it just kind of like evaporated. So for me, experiencing on both ends, like from this perspective of being immersed in this white environment to the perspective of then being immersed in a community of color, immediately you see the disparities. So for me as a young person, it was like, wait a minute, I want to go back to that white school where I had all of the great equipment and all of the access. Like, I don't want to be here in this struggle school where the chalkboard is dirty and, the classes are overcrowded. So that was always the shifting between these two kind of perspectives and worlds.
One of the instances that you talk about in terms of the African American experience is you visit your boyfriend's parents, I believe, in Ohio, and you visit a
Hmm.
carousel. And what struck me about it is that you seem to begin to realize, I guess, a racial cage, as it were, I guess, maybe for lack of a better
Hmm.
word, that African Americans live with every day. Tell me a little bit about that incident and the fact that you had this white
Hmm.
group of white folks who were staring at you.
Yeah, I dated this really wonderful guy from the Midwest. His family was a black family, and his dad was brought to that area to be a doctor. And one of the stories he told me was, as soon as his dad arrived, the clientele refused to come to the clinic that he was hired to run, and that set the stage for their experience in the Midwest. And by the time I was walking into it, they had become so anesthetized to being treated as these outsiders that were being stared at. So his family was like, okay, we're going to go on this little tour of our little white neighborhood, and we're going to ride this carousel. And as soon as I walk in, there's this heavy feeling that comes over me because I look around the environment, and everybody is white, and we are black, and they are staring at us. And I'm literally like stepping like one little quiet step at a time, like, are we going to survive this? And I turn to look at my then boyfriend and his family, and they're like, do, everything is normal here. So, you're always, it really forced me to grapple with what it meant for them to be black in that environment and what they had to do in order to survive that environment, meaning their mental and emotional state and how numb and anesthetized they had to make themselves to just survive.
Because one of the things that struck me is that you came in as obviously an immigrant and you had this varying experience in terms of expectations. But for that family or for families that are born here and have generations that reach back, this is it.
Hmm.
This is what they are born into. What do you make of that experience? I mean, and I must say that I'm always uh, ponder the idea that there are these two experiences which are much different. I mean, the people who are white have a much different experience with the society as opposed to obviously people who are black, but also people who are African American and who grow up with this.
Right. It really, um, his family being African American and being and having that long history of what it meant to be African American, they had to teach me, and I had to sit back and say, wait a minute, is this really what it is? Because the truth is, you don't really get the full scope of how black people are treated when you are in your history class. Yeah, they say, okay, there was slavery, but yeah, there was oppression and there was Jim Crow, but guess what? Martin Luther King ended all of that. Everybody just has to work really hard. So you believe that. But then when you start to speak to African American people who have been in this country for centuries and continue to be oppressed and continue to be attacked, and these are families that, regardless of their financial means, regardless, as I told you, his father was a doctor, his mother went to school for engineering. They were very well educated, and yet even they couldn't escape what it meant to be black in America. And that's something that I was forced to learn as an outsider. But oh boy, did I learn.
Because one of the things that's obviously strikes me is that we do have an emerging, I guess it is, African American middle class or upper class for that matter. And much of what's been left behind, particularly in inner cities, is what I think Manny Maribel called hyper poverty. That is, that you leave all these communities behind. What about that contrast? Because you have this changing community as we move through time.
Right. You see, because so many black families were absorbed and even taken out of the context of blackness. For example, when my ex's father, he was a part of a government program that placed him to service this white community. They told him an underprivileged community. He thought, oh, a black one. But he was displaced from the black community and put to service the white community, which rejected him entirely. So there's this removal of, whether by choice or by force, the removal of this middle class and upper middle class from the black community, leaving, of course, the lower classes to try to fend for themselves. And quite frankly, they can't, because as we know, schools are funded based on taxes. And the better paid your citizens are in your neighborhood, well, of course, the better funded your schools will be. And that's just one example, right? So you have this kind of trickle-down effect from sweeping out all of the upper middle class and middle class black families from and them escape or leaving black communities, especially after integration. So of course you would start seeing this hyper poverty, like this impoverished situation in urban communities that no longer have that additional support.
So you left, you decided that you could not come back. I guess one of the questions I had is, for African Americans, there is no going somewhere else, that this is it. What do you make of that dilemma? I mean, it's not like they have another home to go to.
Well, I never really understood why it is that people feel that African Americans are incapable of going to other places, because immigration happens all the time. And I actually know many African American people who travel the world and who have online jobs and live in Ghana, or who live in even different parts of Europe, or who are exploring the world on their terms. And ultimately, America has one of the most powerful passports. Americans have one of the most powerful passports in the world. So there's no reason for Americans to think that the world is not their oyster, just as a white American would think that and become an expat in Costa Rica. There's absolutely no reason why a black American can't feel the same way and explore opportunities elsewhere.
And as opposed to finding it out here?
I don't think that it's in opposition to. I think it's in tandem with. Because I believe that through this, even if it's a momentary just escape, right? It forces you outside of the situation to look in. And I liken this relationship to America as a black woman to like an abusive relationship, a narcissistic abusive relationship specifically. And everyone knows that when you're engulfed in an abusive relationship, it's very hard to see that. So sometimes just taking a step back to allow yourself to see the full scope of what it is you're experiencing on a daily basis and how those forces are shaping how you view yourself and so on and so forth can be so empowering. And that, in my opinion, is what would help me to even continue the fight, because the fight for me doesn't end ever. It doesn't end until there's the eradication of white supremacy. So so deciding to leave or deciding to relocate does not mean you stop fighting.
Finally, in about the minute that we have left, what do you make of where America is now? We obviously went through the era of Trump and still are going through that, as a matter of fact. There is obviously some progress, but in the minute we have left, what do you make of where America goes from here?
America is in a very tenuous situation. Trump was just the beginning of an era of what we are now seeing to be egregious attacks on basic civil liberties, whether you're looking at the crisis with how there's gerrymandering and voting and this attack, as they call it, on democracy. This is a moment that requires a fight. So for those who are not prepared for that fight and who need a moment, perhaps they should go find it elsewhere to breathe and prepare.
Just quickly, do you think we're up to it?
We don't have a choice.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to, no matter what.
We don't have a choice, so we better meet the moment. And I say we because that includes myself.
Well, do immigrants have a responsibility in somehow, just briefly?
Absolutely. We as a collective of black people in the global world have a responsibility to one another. As humans, we have responsibility to one another. Eradicating all oppression and abuse is the responsibility of every single individual.
We've been speaking with Tiffany Drayden. She's written a new autobiography entitled Black American Refugee, Escaping the Narcissism of the American Dream, and we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us this morning.
Thank you.
Efforts to limit the discussion of race in classrooms is raging across the country. In our next segment, we take a look at a Delaware initiative that plans to make the African American experience a part of the public school curriculum. We now turn to Dr. Nicholas Robinson, history professor at Delaware State University, who's helping to develop the program beginning with the 8th and 11th grades. Describe a little bit about the project that you are embarked on in terms of the structure for teaching history relating to race. How did that come about?
The history department secured a grant from the Delaware Department of Education to incorporate and expand K through 12 social studies, civics curricula to include a more inclusive focus on African American history. It kind of was born out of actually young people, which is generally how pure good things actually start. And so these young students, high school, college students, asked legislatures and educators to kind of come up with something that would force their stories, their histories to be included in public school education.
So what kinds of aspects of history are you looking at?
So, for example, when the Constitution is going to be taught, right? Well, then we would address notions of, well, what does the Constitution say about slavery, and explicitly why was, for example, the Three-Fifths Compromise introduced and thus maintaining slavery. So in 8th grade, the Constitution will still be taught, and of course the writers of the Constitution and their backgrounds will be taught, but then it will be expanded to include slavery and what were the motivations for that. So the kind of scope of the project is largely left up to us in the department as historians, but we do still have to fit it in the framework. For example, the 8th grade period that they're dealing with is 1783 to 1877, so that's kind of the immediate aftermath of the Revolution up through Reconstruction. The 11th graders, we will deal with the period from after Reconstruction up through 1968. So those are kind of our broad scopes that we're dealing with. And the important kind of element to this, which we're really kind of conscious of, is that historically there's a disconnect between academic historians and what's being done at the K through 12 level. So we're really kind of conscious of trying to present information, kind of historical evidence in a way that is teacher-friendly and also student-friendly. We're conscious that we're dealing with new subject matter for not just students but also for teachers. So we want to make sure that they're able to manage this new material.
What about this idea that on the one hand they're talking about accomplishments, obviously, for African Americans, and on the other hand, as you alluded to a moment ago, the negative experiences that African Americans have had? How do you balance those two?
And again, we're going back to the students that wanted to have this, who kind of initiated this project 2 years ago. That was exactly their demand, right? They didn't just want the grim story of enslavement and the struggle for freedom and Jim Crow. Yeah, they wanted the stories of black entrepreneurship, of the contributions to American society by the African American community, from the introduction of the first African people into the North American colony in 1619 up through the present. So there is a balancing act, of course, that we want to achieve, but also there is a dearth of information about the reality of the American experience as it relates to some of our more grim moments in the past, which unfortunately include enslavement, Jim Crow, the retrenchment of white supremacist ideas. And that's what history is, right? It's nuanced. It's not either or. There isn't a version that is completely aspirational, and there isn't the cynical version that many of us are inclined to adhere to. There are some contemporary issues that we deal with today that the past can be instructive for us to understand what we're dealing with today. And unfortunately, some of the conflicts that we're in the midst of aren't new.
What do you make of the pushback that we've gotten around the country to the idea of this kind of teaching, or what would be taught? I think it was State Senator Brian Richardson. He says we don't know how it's going to be skewed one way or the other, or if it's going to be an accurate history. There is this sense that somehow, and not just him, but others, obviously, across the country, are saying, well, wait a minute, we're not sure just exactly what's going to be taught here.
Yeah, and that's kind of the obligation of the historian at our institution in this case, is to provide the historical evidence to support the nuanced view of, in fact, the idea that, the Constitution was written in 1787, and there were approximately 2 million enslaved people then, and perhaps the idea was that slavery would wither away, when in fact it didn't. It doubles by 1861. So to explain that based on historical evidence is a fairly easy task for us. But the skew that politicians are nervous about, that's what history kind of is, right? It's a subjective discipline. There is hard evidence that we use to support our theories, and that's kind of the cool thing about what the state of Delaware is giving us, because they have standards that must be met to explain to students that when presented with, for example, multiple pieces of historical evidence, how is it that two historians can come to two radically different conclusions based on the same evidence? So the cool thing about this is that we're teaching kind of critical analytical inquiry into the past, not just kind of hammering away at content, right? And so we can kind of show how history has been skewed in multiple ways. So that's kind of what we're also hoping to achieve with Project. Understanding of the past, not as simple fact.
What do you make of the idea that the people are pushing back? I know that at least in one state there's I think it's a law or a proposed law or executive order that essentially says that you shouldn't teach things that might make people uncomfortable.
Yeah.
What about that?
So that's and I know that that's what Glenn Youngkin kind of ran on in Virginia and succeeded in winning the governorship. In multiple other states, there are laws on the books or proposed to stop teaching things that may feel young people feel uncomfortable about their race, about their gender, about their ethnicity. An observation is that many of those same people and many of those same politicians driving those bills are also the ones that cry out cancel culture when people of their same kind of political ilk are called out for some pretty horrendous things. Like I think of the censorship of Marjorie Taylor Greene in the House of Representatives, and her colleagues called out cancel culture. Well, they're the same ones saying that we shouldn't teach the history of enslaved people or the history of immigration. These are difficult things to confront in our past. So I would say that those laws that are being proposed are really kind of hypocritical in many ways by the people that are proposing them. The idea is it's a political tactic, right? I know that you haven't said it explicitly, but the idea that it's critical race theory being taught in K through 12 schools, it absolutely isn't, right? I went to graduate school, and we didn't study critical race theory in graduate school. It's certainly not being taught to K through 12 students. I mean, this is a fabrication. I mean, you can look at exactly when it was designed as a political tactic by this guy Christopher Rufo a couple years ago as this new boogeyman that we've got to be kind of aware of and stop this indoctrination of our children by the radical left. And that's absolutely not what this is.
In your view, as you study history, how entangled is race in American structures beyond just simply the individual who may or may not view himself or act himself as being racist, but that there is perhaps a structural issue involved in what we now have seen, rising from obviously the early beginnings of the country?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hesitant to, I know that there are many historians and theoreticians that seek a kind of a fundamental unifying story of, in this case, the United States, or even like an origin story, right, that this is what we were built from, right? And I don't think there is a thing, right? There isn't a idea, there isn't a system for any nation of people, but particularly not the United States, that is the kind of driving force concerning how our society is structured. But race is certainly one of the kind of persistent forces in American society. And to ignore that is to be ignorant of the American story. Race was from 1619, very early on with the introduction of the first enslaved Africans, became one of the defining characteristics of then colonial British society, and then in the aftermath of independence of the independent American society. The historical record is quite clear on that. To say that that's the definitive story of the United States, I'm absolutely hesitant and reluctant to say that. But to say that it's one of the an important way of looking at our past, it absolutely is, right? Race, ethnicity, the experiences of immigrants, the experiences of women, right? All of those things are strains of examination that we can use to have a real inclusive view of our past, right? It doesn't mean that we throw out everything else that we understand about the United States, the Republican experiment of the Constitution, right? The Republican with the small r, not the party, right? That you don't throw that stuff out. But it doesn't mean that we can't add these other perspectives of analysis to that story.
What about this idea that when you have students, particularly white students, and this idea that in discussing these issues that they may feel some kind of guilt or defensiveness as opposed to, say, for instance, to achieve awareness? How do you deal with that in terms of presentation of this kind of material?
First of all, what we're dealing with the 8th graders is in the distant past. Okay, so first of all, we have the kind of Band-Aid of time between us in this case. I would be shocked if any teacher presented this as a way of accusing or putting a young person in the position of having to reflect on, their ancestors as these horrific monsters that enslaved people from distant lands. That's not the point. What we're, there are some things that are clearly going to cause discomfort among multiple people, but the idea that there may be some discomfort among some young people in a few rare classrooms, I think that the balance of the past and the experience of African Americans and their level of discomfort and agony and kind of persecution, I think that, on balance, if there's going to be some sort of perhaps a little twinge of guilt among a small percentage of people, then I think that perhaps that's a bridge that we should cross, right? Because that's, unfortunate that some people are going to feel uncomfortable in a classroom. A classroom and a learning experience is meant to challenge students and confront some things that they may not feel entirely comfortable confronting.
Do you see a difference between guilt and awareness?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. A young person shouldn't feel guilt because half of the nation split to fight a war to defend the enslavement of people of African descent. You shouldn't feel guilty about that. You should be aware of it. Exactly. I think that's a really important point. There's a massive difference between that. I think that's kind of the purpose of the humanistic endeavor is to become aware and then confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves, collectively, individually, and, about our past.
People, of course, can applaud the effort, but one statistic I ran across is that 50% of white students in Delaware do not attend public schools. That's according to a UCLA study of 2014.
Wow.
It doesn't sound like, now I assume that's yours for public schools. It sounds like it may not reach far enough, at least for white students.
That statistic is shocking. Yeah, I mean, I wasn't, I plead ignorance on that. It sounds as if that's a massive statistic. And Delaware is such a small state. I think the population of Delaware is just under 1 million. With that said, it's at least a point of departure. That the state of Delaware is in many ways going against the tide of many other states, as you mentioned, Virginia, Oklahoma, Texas, where they're trying to pass laws banning the teaching of this so-called critical race theory. Well, not so-called, it is a theory, but it's not being taught. But yeah, I mean that's an absolutely important statistic for us to consider. But again, as the kind of tasked with working on the subject matter in our department, I would say that those sorts of issues of reaching different groups of people, different students, is probably a question best posed to the Board of Education itself. I'm really excited that we've even been given the teeth of the law behind us to be able to move forward with these revisions in the public school curriculum.
We've been speaking with Dr. Nicholas Robinson, a history professor at Delaware State University, who is working on developing the efforts to include the African American experience into the curricula of the Delaware public school system. This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Delmarva Today with Don Rush.